I now invite the member of the International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in Law Enforcement, Ms. Tracie Keesee, to have the floor.
Thank you and good morning. Distinguished chairpersons, excellencies, dear expert colleagues, dear delegates, good morning. I'm honored to address the General Assembly Third Committee representing the International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in law enforcement. To date, the mechanism has produced 4 thematic and 5 country visit reports, held 4 annual sessions, transmitted 16 letters to member states on specific incidents and situations, among other activities you can find detailed in our annual reports. For example, last week, we sent a letter to the Brazilian government regarding a police operation in Rio de Janeiro that left more than 120 people dead. The mechanism would like to thank all of our partners, including states, national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, and affected communities and individuals for their contributions to this year's report. Their participation in the call for inputs and the consultations held during our annual session last May were critical in informing the preparation of our current report. Our report highlights the systemic racism against Africans and people of African descent in the criminal justice system is pervasive, deeply entrenched, and reinforced at every stage, from initial police contact to post-conviction procedures. In our continuous interactions with affected communities and individuals, we receive information that the early stage of the criminal justice process against Africans and people of African descent is marred by racial profiling, surveillance, over-policing, unjust targeting, and pretrial detention, among other breaches. Unequal access to fair trial, compounded by a lack of legal representation and structural socioeconomic disadvantages, led to a lack of access to appeal, parole, and rehabilitation. Factors such as gender, sexual orientation, migratory status, socioeconomic condition, and age increase the risk of discrimination against those of African and African descent, in particular, women and children. The historical origins of many legal and law enforcement institutions established during colonial rule, rooted in racially oppressive systems, continue to shape contemporary practices. Racial stereotypes portraying Africans and people of African descent as inherently criminal not only influence individual decisions by police, judges, and prosecutors, but also distorts the entire criminal justice systems. The overrepresentation of people of African descent in prisons and detention facilities across multiple countries is both a consequence and a symptom of systemic-based biases in criminal justice legal systems. All of these violations are at high risk of increasing in the current global context. Addressing this injustice demands bold, systemic transformation. The evidence clearly shows that reforms must go beyond superficial policy adjustments and instead dismantle the structural foundations and co-create a new public safety systems. In the report we presented last month to the Human Rights Council and that we are presenting here today, the mechanism identifies 12 key elements needed for criminal justice systems to free itself from racism and discrimination against African and people of African descent. These 12 elements include, among others, the elimination of racial profiling and discrimination in access to bail and parole, and fundamental issues such as adequate training of law enforcement, the use of disaggregated data, and the diversity and representation across the justice chain. They also include promising practices such as racial cultural impact assessments, sentence reviews, or restorative justice measures with alternatives to incarceration. Further, recommendations such as shifting away from the old narrative supporting policies of the so-called war on drugs and adopting instead a human rights-based public health approach to drug policies are also incorporated in our report. We call on all states to implement these recommendations. We need to work together to overcome the issue of systemic racism against Africans and people of African descent in the criminal justice system. Dear Chair, we would also like to thank Belgium for the genuine cooperation extended through our country visit conducted in June of this year. The mechanism is of the view that systemic racism against Africans and people of African descent in Belgium, as in many other countries around the world, is rooted in the legacies of enslavement and colonialism, which continue to shape structures, institutions, and societal attitudes today. The denial of the existence of systemic racism by some is compounded by the amplification of racist and xenophobic rhetoric and the persistent portrayal of Africans and people of African descent as outsiders, criminals, and inhuman. The impact of these dynamics is visible across multiple sectors, including in law enforcement and the criminal justice system, where instances of racial profiling and other violations, underrepresentation, and a lack of accountability continue to erode trust in institutions. The mechanism expresses satisfaction and willingness of the Belgian officials to engage in dialogue and to cooperate with us. We acknowledge the efforts taken to address racism thus far, including in context of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. The mechanism looks forward to continuing to cooperate with Belgium to implement the recommendations contained in its report. Excellencies, I would like to thank other member states that have received the mechanism's visits: Brazil, Italy, Sweden, and the United States, as well as states that have invited the mechanisms to visit in the future: Australia, Canada, Colombia, and Morocco. I thank also others cooperating with the mechanism in relation to specific incidents and situations such as Germany, Spain, and Switzerland. I would also like to extend the mechanism's appreciation to our Secretariat for their dedication to the realization of all of our activities. Systemic racism is not a manifestation of misapplied commentary or wokeness. It is through research and disaggregated data shared by community members, city and state agencies, and scientists, all recognizing that dismantling it through systemic transformation is not enough and only a matter of justice, but an essential act of reparatory justice for centuries of historical violations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Keesee, for your presentation.